Hello, and thank you for joining me. So, it's been a few days since I've uploaded a video, and I've been going through my mind what sort of things I'd like to talk about. Someone did suggest a while back that I make a video about Brexit and the ongoing negotiations. Now, I agree that's a very topical subject. Of course, it's going to be the defining issue for this country over the next 2.5, 3 years. The main reason I haven't made a video about it is, hand on heart, honestly, I'm a little bit tired of hearing about Brexit. So from a personal emotional perspective, I know it's an important subject, but I am actually a little bit tired of hearing about it. Nevertheless, I do concede the point that it is topical. So what I'm going to do is try and find some sort of avenue to discuss it at some point. So at some point I may make a video about that, but the only reason I'm not doing so now, when I make videos, it's something that I'm interested in at the time. And it's not that I don't think Brexit is important. It's that, to be honest, I'm a little bit tired of all the back and forth, point scoring, and it's almost become a Punch and Judy show, to be honest. So from that point of view, I'm a little tired of that. So I mentioned at one point I want to talk about. I think in the last video I mentioned I'd like to talk about Sunderland. Sunderland's bidding for the 2021 UK City of Culture, and I'm not going to talk about that in this video, but I may talk about it in the next video, so stay tuned. No, in this video, what I want to talk about is the perception of bias in the media. This is a huge, huge issue, a huge issue, in particularly in countries where freedom of the press, freedom of the media is a very important thing, and from a wider point of view, freedom of expression is considered sacrosanct. I was just watching clips of CNN and Fox, and they all had the pundits. They all had commentary on the latest goings on in the Trump White House, the resignation of Reince Priebus, and the latest drama within the Trump White House. And it's virtually impossible to escape noticing that there is a certain angle that every network takes. Now, in the UK, I would argue that the print press has a greater influence, arguably, than the news media. Um, Whereas in the United States, the news media has a greater influence in the print press. I'm not suggesting for a second that the news media doesn't have power in the UK, it does, nor am I suggesting that the print press doesn't have power in the United States. It does. But these are the two countries that I focus most on in terms of media power. I I have access to networks around the world. You know, I have access to Russia Today, CGTN, which is a Chinese state media network. But what I find is that they are so predictable. It's almost less of it's kind of a given. Russia Today is an absolute mouthpiece of the Russian government. It never even tries to hide its Russian nationalistic bias. And it goes without saying that Chinese state media is controlled by the Communist Party. So I kind of think that it's almost like they're wearing their heart on their sleeves. You know what you get with those networks. Now, in the West, what I find is that there is this constant war of attrition between left and right ideology. If you are someone of a left wing persuasion and you spend any degree of time watching, say, Fox News, or looking at the British tabloids, the British right wing tabloids, it's likely that your perception is going to be the right has the upper hand, the right is controlling the media influence. Now, if you're a right wing or conservative persuasion and you look for any significant time in the BBC or CNN, you might be convinced that actually it's the left that has the upper hand. And being from a centrist persuasion, I can understand why both perceptions would be out there. I think one of the biggest problems in the United States in terms of news media is that there is zero accountability. In the United States, unless I'm mistaken, there is no independent watchdog to scrutinise media power. Now, in the UK, we have something called Ofcom, which basically registers complaints against big networks, whether it be the BBC or Sky News or any other network. It's far from perfect, and bias still continues, but at least there is a principle there. Now, I think in the United States, I think the reason so many people get angry with the likes of CNN is they have no accountability. Um, and I do think Fox News is just as bad. There are those who say Fox themselves like to present themselves as outsiders. Let's get real here. Fox News is mainstream conservative viewpoints. It's not it's not a rebellious little underground network. It's in its own right, it's a pretty powerful network. Maybe not as far reaching as CNN, maybe not as powerful as CNN, but the fact of the matter is both networks are powerful and both of them are as biased as each other. CNN has a clear liberal bias, Fox News has a clear conservative bias. Um, and the problem I find is that there's just no level playing field. There's no perception of a level playing field. So CNN, very, very occasionally, they might voice a conservative viewpoint. Likewise, very occasionally, Fox News might voice a liberal viewpoint. But so long as there's that perception and that lack of accountability, and what I mean by that, I should clarify what I mean by this. If CNN makes a mistake, if Fox News make a mistake, they might offer a kind of half apology. But they will spend far more time, especially CNN, complaining about how the president is portraying them. Now, I'm not a fan of Trump, and it is not my intention with this video to play Trump's advocate and say, oh, he's completely right about the biased media. I think that Trump has himself shown a lot of flip flopping. I don't think he can exactly stand up and say that he's been entirely consistent and honest in his public statements. He hasn't. I mean, this transgender thing in the military, whatever you think of it, that's clearly flip flopping because during the campaign, he went out of his way to say, to try and get LGBT votes. Now, whatever you think of it, that's it's just cynical and wrong to go back on that. If he was planning to, stop transgender people in the military, he should have said that in the campaign. But that's not the focus that I want in this video. The point I'm making is Trump is kind of the messenger. There is a deeper issue here, and it goes beyond Trump. It goes to the point of when you have a very powerful news network, they are not giving a voice to their critics. And then they have the audacity to turn around and say, we're the victims. The point I would make is the news media, they need to always remember that they are in a very, very powerful position. In democratic countries, the news media has enormous power, especially the likes of CNN, when they can basically report what they want. And if people feel that they are biased, they never have to answer to that. They don't even bother answering criticism on their Facebook page, of which there is an enormous amount. Now, the BBC, for all its faults, at least it will respond to criticism. It's still biased. It's still, the thing about the BBC, since I'll just talk about that since I brought it up. It's interesting because left-wing people in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn supporters, are convinced that the BBC has a conservative bias, and yet conservatives are convinced that the BBC is institutionally a left-wing organisation. It's very politically correct. It's very almost liberal elite. So the truth is, I appreciate that big networks are never going to please everyone, but what they do have to do is give some sort of semblance of modesty. And I think for the most part, they've utterly failed to do that because they've got so caught up in playing the victim and saying, press freedom is so important. Therefore, anyone who criticizes us, any politician who criticizes us, is threatening press freedom. Now, I happen to believe that some of the points that President Trump has made are legitimate, actually. I don't agree that every time Trump is criticised, that indicates, fake news. And I think that narrative is dangerous because then it leads to this idea that every single critical piece about the president is fake news. Now, that's a problem because it then does create a threat to press freedom. But to me, it really is. I don't think CNN's in a position to play the victim. They have been exposed in some very questionable situations. After one of the debates, I forget if it was the second or third presidential debate, there was someone from CNN. I can't remember if it was Dana Bash. It was one of the big wigs at CNN. Was actually caught whispering to a Democratic watching group, this sort of post analysis thing they do, basically gesturing for them what to say. I mean, that stinks of corruption. As far as I'm concerned, CNN has to be addressing issues like that. And the problem is, the only way it gets any notice is on alternative media on YouTube. And then it gets into conspiracy theory realms because if these big networks do not start to take some accountability, then it will end up in the realm of tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists who say that it's all fake news. It's kind of like if you have no blame, then you've got nothing to hide. So as far as I'm concerned, if CNN is tired of being accused of being fake news, the onus is on them to counter that and say, look, if we have been caught in questionable situations, we're going to address this directly. But what do? They just sit around in their little panel and feel sorry for themselves and pontificate about how awful it is that the president's attacking them. Now, they have a right to defend themselves. I'm not begrudging them that. But they also, I believe, have some responsibility to counter these claims because it isn't just President Trump. There are millions of people, and not just Americans, millions of people who genuinely think CNN is deeply corrupt. And this falls for every big network. Here in the UK, there's a very controversial issue with the license fee. The situation is that if you have BBC services, you have to pay an annual license fee. I believe it's £149. Mine is coming up in 1 month. It's quite a lot of money. Um, and a lot of people deeply resent that because they take the view, why should we pay for propaganda as they see it? As far as I know, and I'm not 100% sure about this, but as far as I know, you don't have to pay a license fee for other services like Sky News. Um, Now, on one hand, I would contend that the BBC has some of the best services in the world. I believe they still make some of the best documentaries around. They do have some genuinely quality television. But without question, there are things that gall people. And there are examples that can clearly um, people look to and they say that the BBC is promoting some sort of agenda with this. I mean, there isn't a day goes by when they're not pushing some story about feminism or about, with all respect to my LGBT viewers, about LGBT issues. So at some point, it starts to look like it's no longer about reporting the news, but actually reporting and advocating social movements. Now, I'm not saying those movements are right or wrong. I'm just making the point that when a major news network, and the BBC, I believe, is still the largest in the world in terms of its workforce, it's certainly the oldest. When it starts constantly promoting those stories, people no longer see that as simply presenting the news. They see it, for right or wrong, as promoting an agenda. The same goes for CNN. Um, I know CNN has had this publicity thing recently. They have Christiane Amanpour saying it's not about being neutral, it's about being honest. But that's just the point, Christiane. Many people don't think that you're honest. And it's all very well kind of getting defensive and saying, oh, please don't attack us. It's up to you to start being accountable. It's up to you to start saying, well, okay, this is the criticism. We're going to directly address that. CNN's attitude so far has simply been to ignore it. But they play the victim. Now, like I say, I don't think Trump is right, and I think this policy of conducting his entire presidency through Twitter is a joke. It really is unprecedented, and I think apparently the when he made the transgender announcement, there was a 9 minute gap between the first tweet that he was going to consult his generals and the second, which was about the transgender issue. In those 9 minutes, apparently a lot of people were genuinely wondering, is this going to be an announcement of war on North Korea? Now, that's why tweeting as a policy matter is just, I think it's a joke. But that's just my opinion. He's not my president, and it's just my humble opinion as a citizen of the world. But anyway, what I want to drive at with all of this is I don't think there is any network, newspaper, or outlet that is 100% neutral. And I think it would be far fetched to expect that. But at the very least, I think it is reasonable to expect at least some semblance of trying to present a level playing field, even if you have a network that's 60% left wing, 40% right wing. That would be better than 80% left wing, 20% right wing, and vice versa. Or at least, if these networks get criticized, they should have the honesty and the decency to directly address that criticism if it is consistent and it's the same point. And they just won't do it. Now, in the UK, like I say, we have Ofcom. It's not perfect. I believe probably it can be even more empowered, but it's better than nothing. Although I do believe that our print press have a long way to go. They will make a mistake on page one. They continue to have this culture where they'll make an apology in small letters on page 30. I also believe absolutely, and this might be detracting from the point, but comes down to media power. I believe it should be absolutely illegal for any newspaper to buy paparazzi photos. I believe the paparazzi are stalkers, and I think that should absolutely be illegal. That is absolutely not a freedom of speech issue. It's grubby little tabloid rags, taking the worst form of journalism. I'm reluctant to even call it journalism, and using that to sell newspapers. Anyway, this is something that people are always going to have very strong views on. I admit there's times when both the left wing media and the right wing media really, really work me up because the bias is so obvious. And like I say, depending what background you're from, you're going to look at it in a certain way. I often notice that people who are from a right wing persuasion are convinced that it's the left wing establishment controls everything. Now, people who are of a left wing persuasion are convinced it's the right wing establishment controls everything. I believe the truth is somewhere in the middle. I believe that within right wing media, within left wing media, that is where there is the control factor. And it tends to be where the pendulum is swinging at a certain time. So, as it stands, we have an outside president um, who has managed to popularize the idea of the liberal elite. For right or wrong, that is the perception that is out there. And instead of constantly saying, "Oh, why isn't Trump stop picking on us?" they need to start actually addressing these points. If they've got nothing to hide, then they shouldn't fear doing that. And I think that would be far more effective than simply sitting around in a panel and saying, "Oh, how awful it is. Let's feel sorry for ourselves." And this applies to every media network. I appreciate that journalism is not an easy job. And sometimes we forget that. It's not an easy job. It's not easy doing the research and trying to please everyone all the time. It's impossible, in fact. But at the very least, there should be some semblance of professionalism. What that means is taking some accountability when you're criticized. I'm not saying they have to agree with the criticism, but at the very least, they should respond to it. So, as an example, if you get a wide range of people criticizing CNN for being fake news, it's up to them to say, look, this is our source, this is accurate, this is why we presented it this way. It's not fake news. I personally don't believe that every report is fake news. The problem is, so long as there is fake news out there, and it isn't just CNN, you can find this very often. It's probably some teenager in Serbia making these things up. The BBC actually done a report. We actually get these people. Personally, I think it should be a very serious offence to make up a story. It's something that can literally cause violence. You know, it can have a butterfly wing effect on the other side of the world. If someone makes up a story, it gets misinterpreted. That can then provoke a riot. So I believe that people who do this because they're bored, they need to face jail because it's tantamount to really the worst sort of shit stirring, and it's incredibly reckless and selfish behaviour. Okay, I'll leave it there. There's a lot to go on with this one. Let me know your thoughts. Is there any possibility of there being a genuine level playing field in media? I don't know that there is, but so long as there is a different spectrum of opinions out there, I believe that powerful networks have a responsibility to be accountable, to address the criticism that they do face, rather than constantly pontificating in self pity. Um, because they are far more powerful than any individual Western or politician in a democratic society. That's something that needs to be remembered.